So, hello. I don't know what language we should use today, maybe Portuguese, a little bit of Spanish, English, and Portuñol for sure. And I first would like to welcome all the new fellows and to start our second roundtable today with the presence of Raquel Rojas from Mecila and Freie Universität Berlin. Also André Nahoum, from the University of São Paulo, and also Jonas Medeiros from Center for Critical Imagination at CEBRAP. And I would like also to mention and thank for the presence of some fellows and researchers from the new research center at CEBRAP. They are fellows from CCI. They are here because I know that we have a lot of issues and discussions in common. Thanks for the presence, and I would like to thank especially in the name of Marcos Nobres, the president of CCI, and also Jonas here is the research director, isn't it? Yeah, okay, yeah. All right, also the presence of Adrian Lavalle, is the president of CEBRAP here. And okay, so you have 20 minutes, isn't it? Okay, no, I maybe Raquel, could we start with you? Raquel will present the following talk, Informality and Care, Rethinking a Dynamic Relationship. And Raquel, please.
Thank you very much, Rúrion, for the introduction, and everybody for this opportunity to present some of my work and discuss it with you here today. What I want to do here is to really rethink this relationship that has been persistent and it's also dynamic between informality and care. And I really took this invitation to present here as an invitation of us to also see how considering the concept of informality could allow me to see some aspects of care and things in my research that I hadn't considered before. And I found the exercise to be quite rich for myself, so I thought of sharing it with you. But before going into that, I think it's important to make sure that we're on the same page when we talk about care, because care is a really broad concept that includes many relationships, and that's also related to different other concepts that have been used in the past. So it's related, but it's also different to concepts such as reproductive labor, household labor, domestic labor, etc. And I want to start by saying that care is part of the economy and that care is work. And probably when I mention this, many of you will think of discussions that were prominent, particularly in the 60s and 70s in Europe and in North America, and especially the campaign wages for housework. So what I mean by this is precisely what this image is telling us in a quite illustrative way, I think, that there is not such a thing as two completely separated and independent spheres, the public and the private one. And there is not such a thing as the market as an entity that works by itself and then everything that happens within the household. As this image puts us quite clearly, I think, in order to have this figure of the male laborer that goes to the factory and that works there for so many hours a day, we need to have somebody at home that will cook his meals, that will wash his clothes, that will raise his kids, that will clean his messes. And in this sense, the first discussions related to care, but again, that were framed in different terms, wanted to point out this, that care is part of the economy, that is also work, and that it also produces value. But then we also see that nowadays the discussion is about care. And it is related to what I was saying, but at the same time, it's trying to point out something different and in a way to be a bit broader. So when we talk about care, we're not only interested in the people providing care services and to what happens to them and how their work is integrated in capitalist relations. We're also trying to look at what happens at the other end of the relationship. So what happens to the person receiving care, and all the relations that emerge in between. So we're still talking about similar phenomena, but the focus changes a bit. It's also important to bear in mind, and for my research, it has been quite important to highlight this, that care is a vector for reproducing inequalities. This has been framed in these terms by feminist economist Corina Rodriguez Enriquez from Argentina. And what is meant here is, of course, we know that care services are unequally distributed in society, but also care responsibilities are unequally distributed. And those people that tend to be able to transfer care responsibilities to others, freeing their time in order to devote their energies and their time to better valued activities, are already in a better position in society. So it's really a reproduction of different types of inequalities. And it's not only about gender. We also know that people that tend to bear the brunt of care responsibilities are cut across by other axes of inequality. So race, ethnicity plays a big role, also citizenship, class, etc., depending on the context we're analyzing. Care is also a realm of conviviality. So this is something that has helped me to frame also my research. And I say this because care relations tend to happen in everyday situations, in everyday relationships, that make the differences between the people involved more clear. And I think a quite illustrative example is to think about what happens in households that hire paid household workers. And in a way, it is this physical proximity what makes the social distances more clear and more palpable. Care is also a hinge concept in the sense that it really links analysis of what happens at the micro and the macro level of analysis and the structural level. And an example of this could be that even if we're considering quite personal and familial decisions, who is going to stay home and take care of the kids, who's going to work only part-time, they seem to be quite personal decisions, but in reality, they're also cut across by the social organization of care of a particular society. So when we focus on care, this really allows us to see these different aspects and how they meet at this, the social organization of care. And last but not least, care is also a matter of public policy. This is important for me for the research that I'm doing right now, but I also want to point out that this has not always been the case. For the longest time, these issues were not considered as a matter of public policy, but over the last decades and years, particularly in Latin America, we have seen a big emergence of discussions, but also constructions, and in some cases, even implementations of care policies and care systems throughout the region. Now, let me bring to my presentation the informality part. Normally, when we think about care and informality, we tend to focus on what happens at the level of the labor market. And I want to say something about that, but my intention is also trying to go beyond only focusing on the labor market, because care is much broader, as we have been seeing. It's not only about paid work relations. Nevertheless, when we think about this interaction, I think that the first thing that comes to mind is the situation of paid household workers or domestic workers. And we know that even in societies such as the ones in Latin America, where the incidence of informality in the labor market is really high, for people devoting their time to this activity, informality is even higher. So depending on how we measure it and on the year of the data, of course, some numbers might change, but we know that over 77.5% of women are working informally, and this is an average. So in some countries in the region, the informality level is even higher. And I say this is a persistent relation because it has been so historically. So I think it's also important to discuss what are the sources of informality. And here, when I'm talking about informality in the labor market, what we're referring to is all those people working informally are those that are not covered by the regulations that are in place. So there are two different sources. One is legal exclusion. So for the longest time, particularly in the case of household workers, they were not considered at all in labor laws and labor codes. So when these regulations were prepared in different countries, they were not mentioned at all, or if they were mentioned, it was only to say, yeah, but they are not granted the rights that were being discussed here. This situation has changed, particularly over the last decade. And in Latin America especially, we have seen a really wave of changes. This is a map in which you can see different countries in Latin America and different years. Those are the years in which these countries made some changes in their law in order to grant labor rights to household workers. In some countries, you see more than a year. That means that the change was more step by step. I'm not going to go so much into detail into this. Actually, I work on this more closely for my PhD research. So if you're interested in this, we can discuss it later. I just wanted to say here that this was possible thanks to many, many years of organizing of household workers at the local, national, and transnational level. But then there's also another source of informality, which is the lack of implementation, because as you all well know, even if we have a really good law that has been put in place, things are not going to change from one day to the next. And actually, this is the main source of informality for paid household workers in Latin America. Here we have some official data saying that only 7% of informality for these workers can be explained due to legal exclusion, and the remaining 93% is due to lack of implementation. And again, I want to insist on this idea of a persistent relation, because even if some governments have tried with different mechanisms to overcome this, it seems that it's quite difficult. And here I wanted to share with you an example from the case of Argentina. And I'm going to draw on a paper written by Francisca Pereira and Lorena Poblete. It hasn't been published yet, but I was lucky enough to review it for a journal. In which what they say is that it seems that in Argentina, there's like a 26% limit or ceiling of formalization, that even if they have tried with different mechanisms to formalize more the people working as household workers, it has not, we have not seen an improvement in this case. And I think the case of Argentina is particularly interesting because the law is really implemented in a broad sense. In this new law in Argentina, people working at least 1 hour a week as paid household workers are considered household workers, and as such should be granted all the rights that the law declares. The situation in Brazil, for instance, is completely different, because in Brazil, you are only considered a household worker, and as such, you have right to access all these labor entitlements if you work more than 2 days a week for the same employer. So you can see that also this definition of who is really a worker, even if they're doing the same type of job, really changes a lot. And this, of course, will have a big impact. And in Argentina, as I was saying, they tried really different measures. Of course, I'm talking about pre-Milei governments. So they simplified the formalization process. People could only call or do it online or use an app, like employers to formalize their workers. They also put in place tax and monetary incentives, and they even use some quite creative coercive measures. Nevertheless, this 26% did not go higher. And what the researchers found here is that there are two main barriers, and that actually the bigger one was the one that I cite here on the second point, that as you might know, nowadays, there's not so many people that work as household workers that live in the household for which they work. So they tend to work hourly. And there's a lot of people that work only a lower time of hours during the week. And it still seems to be the case that those that work only a couple of hours a week are still not considered by their employers as workers. They seem to think this is not real work, this is only help. And that's why they're not seeing the necessity to formalize them. So in a way, I think this example points or highlights quite clearly how important it is to still go back to this discussion about care is work, and it's also part of the economy, and it needs to be granted some rights. But as I was saying before, I wanted to go a bit beyond the reflections that take place in the labor market, and see what else can we see when we put together these two concepts, care and informality. So I wanted to also say something about what has been called in some literature informal care arrangements. And in order to be on the same page again, I wanted to share with you this typology that has been developed by Professor Nadia Guimarães. She's a professor here at USP, actually. And she says that there's different social relations or forms of care. The first one is the one that goes through the market. So it has a lot to do with what I have been saying up until now. So when care is seen as a profession, so of course, household workers could be seen in this group, but also nurses, nannies, everybody, teachers working in care professions. So in this form of care, the care part is clear. I mean, it's obvious that these people are providing care, and the work part tend also to be clear. Not so much in some cases, but generally speaking, a nurse, we know that's a profession. It's work. It needs to have a remuneration. But then we also have the form that she calls care as an obligation that tends to happen in the realm of the family. So as we know, some actors, particularly women, are seen as the ones that, as a moral obligation, have to take care of their family members. And here the care part tends to be clear, but not so much the work part. So here care is not seen as a work source. But at the same time, there's a third type of care, which is care as help, that tends to happen in the community. And that is one form of care that hasn't been studied so much as the others. And here the author refers to communities in which, for instance, a woman takes care of the kids of the neighbor, and she does so not expecting a monetary retribution, but maybe in the future when this woman needs something, the neighbor is going to help her. So in a way, we're looking at these fluid boundaries between work, but also exchange, reciprocity, solidarity. And it's a different way of understanding care and obligations too. Now, when we focus on these more informal care arrangements, there's an inequality aspect that is important because in another paper, Nadia Guimarães and Priscila Vieira study, for instance, these more informal care arrangements in impoverished communities in Sao Paulo. So what we see is that many times this informal organization of care has a lot to do with, it's a residual option in the sense that the state does not get to these communities and they do not have the money to meet their care needs through the market. So in a way, it has a lot to do with inequalities. But not only. So if we keep this perspective and we look at different communities, particularly in Latin America, we can see that in some communities, it's just the way care has normally been provided. So not everywhere care is understood only as the responsibility of the nuclear family or of the mother. So there's also like this intercultural aspect that it's important to take into consideration. And here I wanted to take all these reflections to help me think of the care systems, which is the aspect that I'm interested in. And there's an anthropologist that has been studying care practices in Peru for over 50 years, Janine Anderson. And she points out to something that I think is quite important and interesting, that care practices look to the future, in the sense that when we're taking care of a young kid, there's normally an idea of how we want this kid to develop in order to become a grown-up that is functional to society and that can live a happy life. So there is an idea of what a good life should be and how people should be integrated into society. Or put it in another way, when we are thinking of taking care of elderly people, there's also a discussion of what type of life is a life worth living, and then we can also get in discussions about euthanasia, etc. So there is something about the definition of life and what is a life that we think it's worth living. And if we also take into consideration that we live in societies where there are multiple cultural communities, then it's quite clear that we're also going to find multiple ways of understanding care, but also multiple ways of how we want to socially organize it. Okay, it's my last point. And here is where I think the discussion with the care systems, it's interesting, but it also can become tricky, because when we talk about care policies and care systems, we want the state to be involved. And this is not a bad thing. Of course, we want the state to take responsibility, to give us the infrastructure, to help us have minimum standards of quality. But even when I say this, there is a normative aspect, like quality for whom? Who determines what's quality? What are the minimum standards? And what this researcher has said, again, taking into account her research in Peru, is that this tends to end up in a more homogenized view of what care should be. And even if in many policies, in a discursive level, it's being said, we know that we have multicultural societies and we need to take this into consideration, then when the policies are implemented locally, they're all homogenized. Because in a way, the state requires this more, the administrative power requires to see this step-by-step and homogenizing structure. So in these culturally diverse countries, there is a certain risk of discrimination and oppression that we need to take into consideration when we're talking about formalizing care in a way, and formalizing and having it in care policies and systems. So this is just my last slide, just to share with you what this exercise has given me, or in which ways I found it helpful. I think it's helpful because we can see that it's still important to discuss why some people are not being granted rights, even if they're workers as everybody else. But it's also important because it allows us to see some other ways of organizing care socially, and the role that the community can have as a residual option, of course, but not only, because it also can help us see other ways of organizing care and other ways of even understanding how do we want to live our life. And that in the end, it's not only about declaring multiculturality in our programs, but it's really trying to put in place an intercultural dialogue that really takes into consideration other views. And with that, I end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you very much. And now, André is going to talk about the politics of informality in urban marketplaces, informality as a problem and as a policy. You have 20 minutes, André.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to thank the organizers. Ironically, I think what I'm about to do is very similar to what you tried to do, which with much more care, I would say, and competence that I have with informality as a concept, and specifically with informality in labor markets and urban markets in general. And so I'm going to the basics here, and I apologize if that's too basic, but I thought that, well, I'm addressing a very interdisciplinary audience, and it makes some sense to do that, perhaps. But I also want to make a basic point about informality in urban marketplaces, and that's the point. I'd like to argue that informality in urban markets has been the active and the passive product of state practices that result from the recognition by planners that informality poses a problem of knowledge or a problem of legibility. To make this point, I need to go back again to the basics. I need to shortly, very, very shortly, and in a very simplified way, reconstruct what agents, scholars, and planners do when they mobilize this concept of informality or the informal sector. I begin by reviewing the pioneering literature on the theme and the twin discovery of informality as a feature of urban labor markets in many industrializing economies in the 1970s. And I want to do that because it's a very relevant literature to this day, and it helps us to show the disconnection between this scholarly work on informality and what planners and regulators have been doing, but also the shifting meanings and attitudes towards informality, its recognition as a problem of knowledge, and the policies that have been devised to remedy. And then to get to the point, finally to get to the point, informality as a policy, a point that I would try to very shortly substantiate with evidence that I've gathered with a study on the politics and policies towards the down market, an urban vast marketplace for inexpensive, low-cost garment located in central São Paulo in the neighborhood of Brás, that operates under different degrees of formality, informality in this continuum. A marketplace that shares important features with other marketplaces in Latin America, in Mexico City, as Carlos presented before, and in the greater Buenos Aires area. There's not much novelty to what I'm doing here today, but I think it's an important point nonetheless. So to begin, the twin discovery of informality. These are the three pioneering writings that brought about the idea of informality or the informal sector. One of them is a Brazilian researcher from Rio, Luiz Antônio Machado da Silva. This is his dissertation, master's dissertation, presented at the National Museum. Keith Hart, important anthropologist, and this report that was done by a team of researchers from the ILO and the International Labour Organization and the United Nations Development Program, mostly in Nairobi, but they call it in Kenya. In the early 1970s, scholars, along with a team of professionals from the ILO and the UNDP, independently arrived at very similar insights about income opportunities that exist outside formalized employment relationships or enterprises. They were investigating urban employment and underemployment in cities of Africa and South America. What they discovered was informality, the non-formal labor market or the informal sector, as a defining feature of urban labor markets in industrializing and urbanizing countries. Informality in these studies refers to economic practices that operate outside the legal and regulatory frameworks. Interestingly, these pioneers viewed informality as an opportunity, a grassroots, I'm quoting, or indigenous enterprise to generate income opportunities for newcomers, migrants from rural areas, in burgeoning cities of the global south, thereby promoting productivity to organizing and economic growth, It was considered a very viable alternative approach to organizing economic activities. They even address arguments that back then would say informal employment basically involves low pay and the underdevelopment of labor forces. And contrary to those arguments, they would argue that it offers advantages when compared to rural employment, and it produces economic efficiencies and profits. However, this pioneering research and its positive view failed to gain traction and remained disconnected from national and international policy circles into the 1990s. Informality, or the informal sectors, has been regarded by planners as a problem, an anomaly of the developing capitalist economies associated with underemployment, with low productivity, and backwards economies. This miserabilist vision, as some would coin, conceived the sector as a last resort for income generation, when they would disappear where other opportunities available, and its workers were considered the poorest, missed by progress. Informality was thus seen as a problem, and as a problem should be addressed through the creation of formal jobs and the imposition of restrictions on informal activities. These measures aim to counteract negative perceptions that could become self-fulfilling prophecies, as recognized by this pioneering ILO UNDP report from the 1970s. Historically, and reflecting its tripartite composition, the ILO has advocated for state support to businesses to create jobs and provide training to make informal workers employable in formal industries. As recently as 2015, the ILO passed Recommendation 204. You can see it aims at facilitating the transition of workers and economic units from the informal to the formal economy. In the 1990s, authors like Hernando de Soto, Carlos talked about Hernando de Soto earlier today, suggested that informality is caused by poor governance, specifically excessive, burdensome regulation. So the solution was different then, was to facilitate the transition of informal workers into formalized entrepreneurs. The proposed solutions included increasing access to capital, basically to credit, improving the ease of doing business, promoting entrepreneurship, and distributing property rights in informal urban settings. This, of course, marks the beginning of the new attitude and policy towards informality, formalization through regulatory reforms. Now, De Soto's approach reveals what is the underlying problem with informality for planners and government officers in general, and as such, has defined the approaches to tackle it. A problem that was originally recognized as early as in the ILO UNDP report from 1972. I quote, "The problem with employment is that the statistics are incomplete, omitting a range of wage earners and self-employed persons, male as well as female, in what we term the informal sector. If informal activities operate outside the legal framework, they represent basically what the state and its official statistics overlook, creating a problem of knowledge or a problem of legibility. The challenge lies in how to measure this phenomenon, both individual and aggregate income and productivity, to incorporate it into the national product and regulate and tax its activities. Informality presents a knowledge problem specifically within the new representational project of the national economy, which requires the inclusion of all productive activities in the national product while excluding the reproductive activities. Informality, thus, is created by these knowledge practices that identifies some portion of the economy that is missed by official statistics. This problem of knowledge has defined three basic approaches. I'm simplifying here, but these are the three basic approaches that planners, regulators have devised to address informality. The first, making informality legible through formalization policies. The second, suppressing informality, thus eliminating what cannot be known, what cannot be measured. And third, forbearance. Forbearance entails tolerating informal economy's activities, acknowledging their importance for the national economy. While recognizing that informality is a problem, it relinquishes the aim of making them directly legible, although they could still be potentially measured through consumption. All these approaches serve as active and passive policies that produce further informality. The passive suppression reinforce the boundaries of formality that produce informality. The more the state represses informality, the more it creates. Because informality is defined by this exclusion of activities. Then the successive waves of formalization that has been happening since the 1990s in many countries creates legal conditions for activities, but they also exclude. Formalization aims at making these activities legible and regulate them by placing them into new or established administrative categories. But they create conditions and requirements that exclude because not everyone meets these conditions and continue to evade state oversight. And finally, of course, forbearance as a passive policy allows informality to persist and thrive. Now, let me turn to how this approach played at one of the continent's largest urban marketplaces, the down market, and how state policies created informality at the down market. The down market, as I said, is this urban, vast urban marketplace for inexpensive clothes located in the neighborhood of Brás, 1 kilometer far away from the geographic center of São Paulo. It began in 2004 as traders of clothes started occupying the central Brás Square, Largo da Concórdia, during the night hours. Brás is a well-established garment district that has been producing and sold clothes for almost a century. Producers and traders of locally produced clothes, this is very important because we're discussing global value chains before. This is a locally produced, locally traded, locally consumed clothes. These producers and traders, they take advantage of the daily affluence of dozens of thousands of buyers from all over the country, most of which traders in their hometowns. Some of these producers and traders were working for well-established retailers, fast fashion retailers, and they prefer to sell their clothes they produce directly to these consumers. It takes months for municipal officers to realize that this market has been taking place every night. And these, due to complaints from formal shop owners from the neighborhood. It is considered, of course, as a violation of law. The first speeches by municipal officers and the first appearances in media would talk about illegal counterfeit goods sold in irregularly used urban soil. It presents itself to the administration, the local administration, as something unknown and that could not be known and regulated. They assume features based on similar informal urban settings and respond accordingly. They vow to prescribe it. Thus, the first attitude towards the down market is basically a number of operations of law enforcement involving police and municipal officers to suppress street commerce. This is the main. Oh, it's not. Okay, maybe it works now. Thank you. I was not.
It was the first one, so I was keeping track.
Yeah, that was São Paulo's mayor back then, right? And of course, this was these operations were coupled with periods of tolerance and extortion by police forces, some for initial forbearance. The result of this is not eliminating the down market or informality at all. It produced the relocation of the street commerce to other streets. It's not very visible, but the streets that were initially occupied were the ones on red, to warehouses that turned into shopping malls that circled areas, and an abandoned railroad depot, public urban land. And it actually made the down market to extend throughout the entire neighborhood of Brás, in the streets, shopping centers, and the railroad depot. Here we see the marketplace scattered and segmented, first in the railroad depot, the streets, and one of the several shopping centers with stalls and stores for traders. Even inside the shopping stalls, the shopping center, is good to say, there's some degree of informality going on, especially with the production of clothes. Since the 2000s, this has given way to a different attitude. Left-wing municipal governments recognize the significance of the marketplace for traders and the local economy, and promotes successive ways of formalization and regulation of the uses of space using two basic legal instruments. One, a municipal instrument, the land use permit, that grants rights to use public space, streets, and a federal instrument, the individual micro-entrepreneur, as a way of formalizing the scores of informal workers. In the late 2000s, the federal government creates legislation granting some rights. There has also been a growing emphasis on private solutions through these shopping centers and the private concession of the then public railroad depot that turned into this beautifully built shopping center called Down Market. And coupled with that, the informal production of clothes and street commerce persists with extortion and forbearance. And what changed regarding forbearance is that now we have town hall representatives and government representatives stating that this is an important economic activity that generates incomes, that generates jobs, and has helped securing the survival of this garment industry and secure the competitiveness of the garment sector in Brazil. So again, the down market is still there and informality is still there. Many thanks.
Thanks, André. You're doing very punctual. And our last presentation is from Jonas, and he's going to talk about cultural public sphere, informality, and intermediation crisis. I don't know if I translated quite well. Okay. Jonas, you have that's your talk.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I'd like to thank you, Tomás, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with Raquel, André, and Rúrion. But first of all, I need to share with you that we have in Portuguese a word that is marmelada. And I have to say that I'm a bit in the situation of a marmelada. And I asked ChatGPT, how can I explain marmelada in English? So that was its answer. Marmelada is employed to describe in its traditional use something morally condemnable. But in a more humorous and relaxed context, marmelada can describe a strange, confusing, or unusual situation. It's like when something happens so surprisingly or unexpectedly that it seems somewhat absurd or even funny. For example, if something happens in such an improbable way that it seems like a joke or a comedy, someone might comment, "What a marmalada was that?" It's a humorous way to express surprise or perplexity at a peculiar situation. So Rúrion is going to comment our works, our presentations, but we worked together for more than a decade. We have written and published a book, chapters, articles. He's a very good and close friend. And to make things worse, he's one of my informants in my exploratory empirical research. I interviewed him. But okay, it's not my fault. It's not a conspiracy. And this introduction is just a full disclosure to you all. So I apologize for this, but I will read my presentation. There is a certain diagnosis of the present time that is circulating today in a very powerful and convincing way that emphasizes the systemic interdependencies between neoliberalism, digital platforms, the crisis of the expert systems, that would be scientists, journalists, professional politicians, etc., and a new structural transformation in the public sphere that would be in direct line with the rise of the contemporary far right. From a cybernetic or systemic point of view, Brazilian anthropologist Letícia Cesarino argues, for example, that digitalization and neoliberalization would be the same phenomenon, as they co-produce and reinforce each other, resulting in the strengthening of moral conservatism, digital populism, punitivism, post-truth, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, all elements that constitute, for example, Bolsonarismo in Brazil. Why is this happening? From her perspective, because of the destabilization of this expert system, science, the press, and professional politics, we are facing a crisis of confidence in the liberal public sphere. Digitalized politics is breaking away from the mediations of the liberal institutional model, causing epistemic disorganization. The left is included in her diagnosis only because it is replicating the patterns of the new right, but the major tendencies disproportionately benefit the right. The weakening of authorized intermediaries and the monopolies of mediation that until then structured the production and circulation of information in the public sphere would be constitutive of neoliberalism, which leads to the weakening of the expert system and the traditional media. There would be a notable convergence between populism, the free market, the expert system, and post-truth, because they are all based on mediations that produce non-mediation effects. In addition, the institutional bureaucratic apparatus of the public representative system comes to be seen as unnecessary, superfluous, and harmful. The so-called digital revolution would be an epistemic restructuring that combines authenticity and conspiracy. Finally, the processes of truth production are undergoing both chaotic opening up and pulverization. The digital landscape would be regulated by digital mediations that are invisible to users, and we still don't know if we are facing a rupture or an incremental rearrangement towards a new system of experts, but the prospects for her are dark and apocalyptic from a critical or an emancipatory point of view. So, based on these exploratory interviews about the innovation of the critical imagination in different artistic spheres, music, cinema, and literature in Brazil, this diagnosis will be problematized in the face of evidence that the cultural or informal public sphere in Brazilian society has been experiencing a period of effervescence since the early 2010s, with new voices coming onto the scene from subaltern social groups, especially women, Black people, and LGBT people in these 3 case studies. This has to do basically with the revolutionary impacts of both the internet in different circuits of culture and also affirmative action in public universities, resulting in innovative cultural expressions in multiple art forms, as well as the renewal of the publishing market around the social science and humanities, with a proliferation of new critical thinking and the pluralization of voices in the public debate. In terms of my theoretical and conceptual framework, it is important to say that one of my points of departure is Jürgen Habermas' critical theory of the public sphere. And this is the point where it becomes clear why I'm talking in this seminar. Because Habermas is developing a complex approach to the public sphere where we have both formal and informal public spheres. This has to do with a dialogue between him and feminist critical theorist Nancy Fraser about strong and weak publics, but also with previous distinctions that Habermas himself has made between literary public sphere and political public sphere. To simplify, when I'm talking about cultural public sphere, that is a broader term than literary public sphere, I am referring to how different circuits of culture, a very important concept from the cultural studies and also cultural history, are constructing informal public spheres. So the exploratory interviews I have conducted to address the theme of artistic expression were consensual in pointing out that the internet has profoundly reconfigured these circuits of culture, particularly due to disintermediation processes that are specific to each artistic expression, triggering intense creativity in production, democratization in distribution, and increasing complexity in reception. Another political outcome has been the pluralization of voices in artistic and cultural expressions beyond the monopolies of race, class, gender, and sexuality, particularly 1, the unprecedented emergence of women singers who also take on the roles of composers and producers in the independent music scene, 2, the protagonism of the Black independent cinema, and 3, the increase of public legitimacy for embodied literature. So I will present now very briefly these 3 case studies. First of all, about music. The internet has had revolutionary effects in regard to destabilizing the configuration of the circuit of culture in music, which peaked in the 1990s and was marked by the culture industry's gatekeeping, radio, television, major commercial labels, and finally the music journalism in the mainstream media's culture sections. The Brazilian music scene has experienced a democratization process in the 21st century. Artists have gained more independence from record labels, often being able to produce their records and singles through internet crowdfunding and solidarity networks. In addition to revolutionizing the conditions of music production, the internet has also impacted its distribution. With the internet, access to music has been greatly expanded via websites, blogs, and more recently, social media and streaming platforms. MySpace was a precursor, but it has been gradually replaced by Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram. Reception has also changed. Specialized music journalists can now vocalize their critics outside of the mainstream media's cultural sections, as well as amateur critics. In any case, music consumption does not occur only on online and individualized ways. Concert venues and festivals, both large and commercial, as well as smaller and independent ones, remain essential, since music reception listening always occur in offline and collectively shared way as well. Many intellectualized Brazilians maintain a nostalgic posture towards the music production of the 60s and the 1970s, a time marked by cultural and political resistance to the military dictatorship, reproducing a prejudice that Brazilian music has died and been completely dominated by the culture industry's pasteurized products with the predominance of sertanejo, Brazilian funk, and gospel music genres. However, this diagnosis ignores the creative power and new political engagements, feminist, anti-racist, and LGBT, of the Brazilian independent music scene in recent decades. Moreover, it disregards an interesting structural change that contrasts the place women have occupied throughout different generations. While the great women performers in the history of Brazilian popular music were mostly singing male composers, the new generation from the 2000-2010 period is comprised of women who are singers as well as composers and producers, marking out the feminine voice's protagonism, including in the contents of the narratives and emotions that will be sung, thus expanding the critical imagination. This is a whole part that Rúrion cannot disagree because he is the informant from this part mainly. The second case study is about cinema. Independent cinema in Brazil currently lives a moment of effervescence. The protagonism of Black cinema is advancing and recreating the frontiers of critical imagination in contemporary Brazil is particularly noteworthy, a protagonism that is territorially concentrated in the states outside the traditional axis of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. Different individuals and institutions are contributing to multiply the voices and breaking old monopolies of large productions and distribution companies, of commercial cinema networks, of specialized critics anchored in the mainstream media, etc. Two elements were fundamental to this process of creativity. The racial quotas, this process of creativity and film production decentralization, the racial quotas in public universities, and the internet's impact due to its increasing the film distribution window as a result of alternative streaming services, many of them free of charge, and intensifying the public debate about audiovisual productions on social media. The pioneer was Brazilian social media called Filmou, but nowadays the Brazilian debates have migrated to the New Zealand social media platform Letterboxd and to Twitter, where the so-called film Twitter gathers the public. So my third case study, exploratory, all of them, is literature. One of the critical imagination's main frontier in the Brazilian literary field is the slow process of genesis, development, and beginning of acceptance of what can be called embodied literature. That is, literature that make explicit and reclaim social markers of difference, such as race, gender, and sexuality, against the literary canon that considers itself and is treated by specialized critics as universal, supposedly disembodied. In a similar process to what has happened in the music and cinema fields, the circuit of culture in literature is undergoing recent structural transformations because there once were several mediators between the artist and the reading public, publishers, critics, and booksellers. But the internet has driven forward these intermediation processes. Publishers have lost some degree of relevance as a result of the expansion of self-publishing modalities, and the curtailment in their power of control due to how the costs of producing a book are divided. At the same time, literary critics no longer have as much mediation power to either highlight or silence certain themes, works, and authors. For a long time, a fundamental step due to delegitimize embodied literature in the name of universal literature. Several factors have led to the drainage of the literary critics' public presence. On the one hand, the rise of subaltern social groups in cultural production. On the other, the mainstream press cultural sections have decreased or even ceased to exist. In the past, the reader would buy the book, read it, and then either agree or disagree with what the literary critic said. Now, the artist also builds discourses about their own work to present it publicly, writing their own blogs on the websites of small publishers or giving interviews in cultural magazines and other publishing spaces, thus destabilizing the critic's place in the circuit of culture regarding literature. Moreover, now there are booktubers. Booktube is a community focused on books within YouTube. Young people who review their favorite books, a process through which readers can also become non-expert critics. This process reaches the edges of the circuit of culture in literature, authors and readers, generating process of disintermediation and emptying the power of consecration previously monopolized by literary critics. Finally, booksellers have performed a type of non-written criticism work, which also led the power of either make something visible or to silence it. In the independent publishing market's case, certain books that could not be found in major bookstores in shopping malls began being sold online, either directly by publishers on their websites or by blogs of authors hosted on Blogspot or WordPress. These factors have shattered the book ecosystem's previous configuration by establishing a more direct relationship between publishers and readers without the mediation of bookstores, be them large or small. So, as my final remarks, I hope I have convinced you, or at least provoked you, that we are facing a twofold process with the same root. The expansion of the internet is creating a crisis of traditional intermediators, such as scientists, journalists, politicians, art critics, and other old gatekeepers in the culture industry. A general crisis of intermediation. This is a double process because we are witnessing very different political outcomes depending on what social sphere we are focusing. At the political or formal public sphere, for example, apparently the far right is better prepared to profit from this crisis of traditional political representation than left-wing political actors. But at the cultural or informal public sphere, it is undeniable that digitalization is enabling the emergence and strengthening of new actors, new voices, and new narratives, especially those of subaltern social groups. If we consider that the old gatekeepers in this sphere were mainly bourgeois, white, male, and heterosexual, it is no surprise that digitalization comes with a relevant democratization process in terms of class, race, gender, and sexuality. Certainly, we could develop more complex hypotheses about this process, such as we are not facing a crisis of intermediation, but a change of intermediators. This would require new and more profound researches to better understand who these new intermediators are and what are the new patterns of intermediation in the digital age. What I can give you right now is a framework that argues that for the ambivalent meaning of the digitalization process, we are not facing a structural and unilateral process that has to do only with the far right, but we are facing a complex, multidimensional, contingent, and therefore open-ended process that has different political outcomes, and therefore we need to analyze why this is happening, and hopefully to act in terms that these progressive counter tendencies that are expanding our critical imagination can also contribute to reinvent democracy in new, better, and broader terms. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Jonas. It won't be a marmelada. I can say that. Okay. That's great. And well, before taking some questions from you, I just would like to to give you a quick reaction here and ask you very quickly, please, if you can answer me. Raquel, well, this is so important, your research, but I was thinking about how can we understand what could be transformed considering the complexity of care experiences, because it's not enough just to change alternative regulations, institutionally speaking, not just new laws, new norms. You know, the sphere that we have to face when we are dealing with care experiences is a sphere it has to do with, you know, with daily domestic conviviality. That is very difficult. In the three examples that you gave us, considering the three forms of care, you know, work, market, community, and family. So, what could be the alternative for the situation? What should have be changing in this kind of convivial sphere? You know, you gave us the example. You have law, but maybe you don't have the same alternative if we're looking to domestic interaction. So it's very hard to understand what could be changed in this case. You know, well, the situation is very bad. It's very complex. But on the other side, politically and socially, what could be changed? I would like to ask you this. And André, just in order to use the image of relocation, but it's a quick question. How do you see the relationship between regulation and informality, considering that informal marketplaces doesn't want to be regulated at all? They're trying to avoid regulation, it seems, you know. And how do you see this kind of avoiding? They don't want the state, for sure. They don't want the policy, but what actually, in your perspective, they want? They want to stay where they are in this non-regulated marketplaces, or, you know. And Jonas, the last part of your, it's not marmelada, it's just to give you the opportunity to develop the last part of your talk. Just a minute, because it's closed. If you can develop a little bit more, how do you understand informality in your own research? Because we have a digital public sphere, and this intermediation, as you said, can be a new form of social regulation, digital regulation. But on the one side, we know that we have domestic and decentralized production, for example, but they sell this in digital platforms. They can make money with this kind of more disintermediated kind of regulation. So do you consider that this is a specific form of think about what is the new formality of digital mediations, or how could you understand all these examples as examples of the informality of the digital public sphere? How is informal, how is not actually that informal as such? So just to begin with, and then I don't know what would you like to do? I can open and take some questions from the audience, or would you like to answer first, and after that, I don't know.
Yeah, we can answer.
Yeah, okay. So, and then after that, I can open for new questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rúrion, for your question. I think I wish I had an answer to that was clear and direct, and that will have, would be very helpful for all of us. Maybe what I'm going to do is share with you how I got to this question now, because I started working with labor rights for household workers. And it became super evident to me how important it was to have a good regulation, but then also the problem of lack of implementation, that in the end, you can see that only attacking this one issue of lack of labor rights for these workers, it's not enough, and that we needed to focus on the whole system of care and the whole understanding of care in society. Because in the end, what's happening is that because care responsibilities are so unequally distributed in society, those who have power would always transfer their care responsibilities to those who do not. And yeah, if we just look at the last link of the chain, it will be quite difficult to change the whole thing. So it became clear to me that we cannot only discuss the importance of labor rights for these workers, but that we needed to revisit and review how we understand care, and that we also needed to focus on all other care relations, also what happens in the realm of the family, the market, the state. And that's where this idea of care systems becomes quite important, because that's what care systems are trying to do. So the concept of care system is this set of policies that relate to care, and that's super broad, right? But it has to do with education, with health, with preschool kids, with elderly people. And what they're trying to do is really to have like this vision, okay, we need to address gender inequalities, but also class inequalities and everything. And I thought, okay, I found the solution to this all. But then again, if we want to like have this formalization and put it all in a neat package, then the risk is we leave people behind. So I think it's quite complex, but there are things to do, and there are many, let's say, small experiences. And I think something that was mentioned yesterday by Puan, and then later I think by Talia, like this idea of many small solutions to a big problem. So I think the state needs to be involved, and we need infrastructure. So care should be seen as a right. And this is a discussion that actually right now it's being held at the International Court for Human Rights in the Americas. What should the state provide us for us to be able to take care of ourselves and others? But also we need to see what different communities believe about care, and also give them the opportunity to decide and give place to community experiences. So it's quite complex because it's so broad, but I think the way is just trying to recognize that there is no one answer, but that still there's some stuff that can and should be demanded to the state. And in the end, it's about organizing and seeing what each community and territory needs. And I think also different strands of research are doing quite important work. And of course, there's also conflicts among them. So you have the feminist economists that put a lot of emphasis on the economic aspect of care, and that are really interested into having the data on the contribution of care work to the economy, measuring the GDP. Whereas you have other researchers and other groups of activists that say that does not make sense, because we do not want to monetize everything. And this is not a relationship that can and should be monetized. But I think there are parts of the solution in each of these postures. So it's interesting to look at what is being done and try to understand why each position can contribute to the discussion.
Thanks for your question, Rúrion. I think that there are three different answers to the regulation and formality relationship question. Not all traders want to evade regulation. Actually, there are a lot of street vendors that want the one regulation, that want to have their permits, that try to have their permits, and sometimes it's better to deal with the municipal government that with informal associations that distribute urban space illegally, right? That's the first attitude you will find. there in the field, and there are many actually traders who think of the LUPs, this land use permits, and the micro entrepreneurship figure as good solutions to the problem. But then, of course, you do have a lot of traders and traders organizations that are trying all the time to evade this regulation and trying to propose self-organization. And during the last 2 decades of the down market, many of these trader representatives have gone to the town hall to advocate that they are capable of organizing and regulating and acting as the organizers and planners of this space. They have always been denied any sort of participation. And the municipal government has always responded saying, you are not lawful organizations. They are not legally constituted as associations, so you cannot speak for traders, etc. But they have been fighting, just as Carlos has shown this morning, that they try to exert some self-organization and control. And then there's the third answer, which it's sort of a neither nor solution that has become the most favorable solution. Instead of self-organization by the traders themselves, instead of urban planning, let's do private market-based organization of the space. So the municipal government, and back at the time, the officer who was in charge for the concession of the railroad depot was a trade union leader, a very important trade union leader, who said, states don't know how to do with markets. So let's give it to a big firm, and the big firm will know how to do it. And this works as a private solution where public planning fails in their views. And for many traders, this is also a solution. It's just a very expensive solution for them. This is the most expensive commercial rent in São Paulo. I mean, it's not the financial district. We are talking about approximately $50,000 per square meter. And it's very expensive, but it works as a solution to deal with this regulation amidst informality.
It was not marmelade, your question. So about informal public spheres, I guess one way to say is that they are non-formal public spheres. And this has to do with this discussion, as you know, between Habermas and Nancy Fraser. So I guess what is underneath, it's this notion of weak publics. So publics that they don't have power decision. No? There are certainly other informal public spheres than those constructed by these different circuits of culture that I have approached. But I guess cultural public sphere would be an important part of informal public spheres. As I understood, you are like saying, well, these digital platforms, they are capitalist enterprises like Spotify, YouTube, Twitter. And of course, this is central for a critical approach, but a critical approach has to deal with digital platforms are not only a part of this new digital culture industry. In this approach, there would be only accumulation of capital and psychological manipulation. That's what people who read Adorno, for example, are interpreting of what digitalization, neoliberalism, what is happening today. In my point of view, this concept of informal public sphere is important to recognize that people have agency and reflexivity. Even when people are producing and sharing, for example, memes on social media about Barbie and Oppenheimer, very mainstream cultural products, people are producing a public debate and a critical reception of mainstream cultural products. And that's why I think this concept of informal public spheres, that this is such a rich notion to complexify our vision on public debate, culture industry, and digitalization. So again, we need to maintain the ambivalence of things. It is culture industry, but it's also enabling new informal public spheres.
Good afternoon. I'm asking in English, but I think I want to talk to Raquel and Jonas. Eu posso falar em português, talvez? Sim. Tudo bem? Você acha que nem todo mundo vai entender? Não, essas são questões simples de qualquer forma. Eu queria agradecer a Raquel pela apresentação, que foi muito clara e muito esclarecedora. E eu acho que realmente o quadro de formalidade e informalidade, para mim, pelo menos, funciona muito bem para entender esse processo de passar de uma discussão sobre formalização de direitos, né, legalização, para uma visão mais ampla do que são os problemas em torno do cuidado, do care work, né? E eu gostei muito dessa frase, que eu acho que explica muita coisa, que você falou, those who have power will always transfer care responsibilities to those who don't. E a minha pergunta, eu vou fazer a coisa clássica, uma provocação, é que, ainda que muito esclarecedora, você conseguiu falar de care sem falar nem a palavra gender, nem a palavra race. E aí a minha pergunta é, como que a gente fala, então, de gender and race, para entender como é que você encaixa essas duas palavras nessa equação de those who have power will always transfer responsibility for care for those who don't. E também uma outra coisa que você falou, que eu achei interessante, que eu acho que tem a ver um pouco com isso, você falou care should be seen as a right. E aí a minha pergunta é, but whose? Porque eu também acho que é isso, are rich white men not being cared for? Eu acho que eles têm não precisam buscar o direito, ou os filhos da elite branca, o right to care deles também me parece bem estabelecido. Então, exatamente para quem o direito ao care está faltando, o que exatamente quer dizer that care should be seen as a right. Só para explicar um pouco isso. E para o Jonas, eu tenho uma pergunta. É mais uma curiosidade. Na verdade, eu tinha curiosidade para ver o que o José Luiz ia responder na apresentação do... Mas não quero colocar ninguém na fogueira. Porque você falou sobre um dos seus estudos exploratórios a posição das mulheres cantoras. E a minha pergunta é se tem alguma coisa específica sobre mulheres lésbicas cantoras. Mulheres lésbicas sempre tendo tido um papel particular na música popular brasileira, de algo um tanto silenciado para entendidos, para algo tolerado, para algo agora um tanto que vai no sentido do que você está falando. Então, se você pensa nisso, você fala sobre isso um pouco.
Não, eu estou na lista, só para saber. Eu estava bem último. Você está em quinto. Isso, não, eu só estou passando. Quem é o segundo? Terceiro. Então pode ser. Segunda, depois. E aí tem.
Obrigada. Eu vou falar em inglês ou português? I will speak in English. So, yeah, my questions go to, my comments to André and maybe Raquel as well. But yeah, I think that two things called my attention in your presentation. First of all, that you were talking about Brazil as an industrializing country. And secondly, what calls also my attention that the tendency is to treat the informal sector as a separate sector. And principally what is being treated are the relations between the state and the market. And regarding the point about industrializing country, it's like if we go back to the Brazilian socioeconomic thought, then let's say structuralists or dependency theorists, they argued that it was exactly the type of industrialization that didn't absorb or absorbed very tiny parts of the working people in Brazil, and created like the whole sector of unemployed. And this also created like the whole debate about internal colonialism in the 70s, and as well as the debate about the articulation of modes of production, for example, like by Chico de Oliveira and Cardoso. So they particularly, the debate about the articulation of modes of production emphasized the articulation of informal and formal, and in terms of also continuum of, you know, on the other hand, formal wage labor, and then on the other hand, informal workers also having lots of intermediate forms. And in that sense, like one of the important dimension would be exactly, let's say, the reproduction of the labor power, and like diminishing the value of the labor power, that the informal sector permits that, and also thereby diminishing also the wages, let's say, in the formal sector. So how would you then establish the relation, and think in that key? And regarding Raquel, I remember the debate of Bielefeld, sociologist of the 70s, with whom I sympathize a lot. And they argued that the tendency in capitalism is not proletarianization, but housewifeization. And so in that sense, that the sector of informal and not typical proletarians in the world scale, they were taking, like, let's say 70s would be 90%, in that sense that we are more witnessing housewifeization, in that sense, all kind of forms of unpaid or semi-paid and unprotected forms of labor. And you also talk, exactly, despite of the legal frameworks existing, like only 7% are actually being implemented. And that's how exactly like this care sector is like a representation of a much broader tendency in the labor market, or among what's going on in the working people, among the working people globally.
Thank you for the presentations. It's a bit of a provocation that I'm trying to do. Just thinking of all the presentations of this table, and then also what we've been debating, and that it feels increasingly quite unproductive to start off with the formality debate, or differentiation, because it's so much remains implicit, and even in these presentations, and that's what this whole dichotomy is referring to. Who's behind it, or what kind of power is behind it? And in this table, at least, it's very clear it is sort of always in relation to a state, or to a racial capitalism, or to a hetero patriarchy or whatnot. So I think that, so it feels like as if, and in other panels, it was a lot less clear what was the informal or the formal, or the formalizing institution behind that we were implicitly referring to. So I'm curious, so while it very much clearly determines certain phenomena that we seem to be interested in, informal phenomena as it was in this table, but still analytically it becomes sort of very devoid of meaning at the formal informal fields, because it becomes so polymorphous in a way. That's the provocation part. But then it makes me think whether it wouldn't be more interesting really to think of the different regulators or deregulators of what we're actually addressing here. And that can be the state, that can be an ideology, that can be a particular market, that can be a neoliberal sort of form of organization or whatnot. So I find that quite interesting, especially because and that's where I'm coming from initially from my thinking, is that a lot of literature has shown that a lot of what we call informal is actually highly formalized and follows actually very clear norms. and has actually value systems behind it, has actually institutions behind it, as also Carlos has shown this morning. And I find that quite interesting then also to think, and that would also actually give an opportunity to ask a question to Jonas concretely, these otherwise publics that you're debating, right, in your examples, I guess they also regulated in ways. And is that in terms of your critical imagination, a critical imagination of a different form of state, or a different form of public, or a different form of collective organization? So what is the level of abstraction that we are aiming for? Is even the scale of abstraction, the scale of organization, what is at stake in all of these debates? And it would also then also pick up on Raquel's topic of care, because beyond what you've described as care work, I think care is quite interesting because it actually sets out to provide a different framework of how we think human togetherness, to just use it in a very broad sense, in terms, and what you had it in one of your slides as the relational, right, as a different form of conceptualizing who we actually are, and how that determines how we are relating, and where value is located, where a good relation is being established, and how that could be regulated, and how the agency comes together with sort of collective also responsibility. So all of these are, I guess it's more of a provocation, but it's a provocation also to the yearly theme that we're having, but it really made me think a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks. So just to organize, here we have 4 more questions, okay? That's, no, so 5 more questions, that's it. You, no, but it's, not for now. That's the first round. The first round is finished, okay? Just to organize. So we have 5 more, okay? Just to organize the next round. Okay. Como vocês querem?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for your comments and questions. Yeah, Isadora, definitely. I mean, gender and race, ethnicity, citizenship, religion, depending on the context we're looking at, are present there. I mean, I didn't focus on that in this presentation because I have done it so much in the past, maybe. But I mean, it was in a way implied, and there was like a small slide or image about that when I was talking about care as a vector for reproducing inequalities. So definitely, I mean, the people that tend to bear the brunt of care work and care responsibilities are not only women, but also tend to be racialized women from the lower classes and with a different citizenship in the country they're living in many times. So definitely, I mean, we're talking about something that is quite related to inequalities. And whose rights? Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, some people's rights are completely there, but I guess the idea is it shouldn't be, if we're talking about universalizing the right to receive care, it shouldn't be only limited to those that can pay for it. So that's all this discussion about policies and care systems speak a lot about universalizing these rights so that it's not depending on how much income you have. Of course, how to do that is another question, but yeah, it's important to take into consideration that some people have even too many offers, and they do so directly to the detriment of other people. So you can see that, or during the pandemic, there was like a quite clear example of that, how particularly in Latin America, many workers kept working for the families they were working for because they're already used to live there, but who was staying with their kids when they were with the other families. So it's really not a completely zero-sum game, but almost. So if some people have too many options, some others, if we continue with this within this market logic, some other people are going to suffer from the lack of care options. Yeah, and I agree with you that the discussion should be broader, not only about formalizing care. And I'm going to jump quickly to something that Tillman said, and that's why I was trying, I don't know if I was successful, not to speak only about care work, because of course care is work, but I think if we only phrase it within this term, many other aspects get lost in the discourse. So I think that relational aspect it's also quite important. To Krista and the Bielefeld sociologist, yes, definitely. I mean, this has been also retaken by many theorists that are also saying that we still see this. Of course, those examples were a bit more, I don't know, clear maybe, but if we think about so many people, we were talking today already about these textile workshops many times. Many times the people live there in order to also use time. I mean, when they should be socially reproducing their lives, they're also working. So it's really completely intertwined. And you do not only see it with housework, you also see it in some other more factory-like settings, if you wish so. So definitely, I think this is still a quite important debate to have. And about definitions and why are we still discussing about informality? I agree with you that it gives us this false idea that we're treating two completely separate independent spheres. And it's not the case. Nevertheless, it's still the terminology that is being used. And yeah, I think it's productive thinking about other options, but at the same time, I mean, particularly if we're focusing on the labor market, it's quite clear what is meant. Yeah, for me, it's also interesting to think, what do we mean when we mean formalization? And it goes along the lines of what André was presenting. And it also has to do with how do we measure informality? Because it's not that clear. So some people will say that it's all those wage workers that do not have access to some labor rights. But for some others are the ones that do not have contracts. And again, with an example of household workers and the comparison between Argentina and Brazil, I think it becomes quite clear how difficult it is. Because in Brazil, if you only work 1 day a week for a family, I mean, you're still working, but for the law, you're not a worker. So it's really, I mean, then we get into this like really fine definition of what informality is. And I will just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, because you helped me with that, the last one. Thank you. But thank you for your questions and comments, starting with Krista. Let me just explain. I mean, I agree with all but one of your comments. And but of course, I was talking about industrializing in the context of the 1970s and basically using the terms employed by this literature. So it's in the urbanizing, industrializing context of the 1970s that we have a reserve army of labor that turns into informality, right? And you're right, there was this trend to treat informality as a different sector, and by treating informality as a problem of knowledge, I think we can circumvent that in a way, because it explains why it has been traditionally seen as a different sector, because something difficult to read. There are many ways of or attempts to reading what is going on in the informal sector, but of course it has a lot of ties with the formal sector. It produces for the for the formal sector, and it's also consumed. I mean, the clothes bought at the down market are mostly sold in formal shops. So I think it's much more productive, as you said, to think about this in a continuum, and that's what I think it's the down market provides a very good example of that. The only point that I would disagree is with the contention that the informal work, or the informal sector, as they would put in the 1970s, diminishes wages and the labor power of workers. That's exactly what these pioneering studies have shown in the 1970s, and they continue to show up to the 2020s. I mean, first, because when you say diminishes, you have to compare past and present, right? And if we look into the Brazilian economy, I mean, informality has been around for ages. We have never had more than 50% of our economic active population in the formal sector. So it means that for many workers, informality and some periods of formality, and I mean, again, we could go back to Chico de Oliveira, and he was already discussing this. for a lot of workers, informality has been the rule, right? So it's very difficult to say, well, it diminishes. Well, these initial pioneering works on informality were comparing income from workers coming from rural areas, and compared to what they were gaining in the rural areas, actually, the wages were much higher. Yeah, of course.
No, in that sense, like it's not that the wages of people in the informal sector have diminished. I mean, like, it's a relational in that sense, like in a way, if you have a sector with like a low cost garments and clothing, and like reproduction of the workers in general depends on this kind of informal markets as well.
Yes.
I mean, like it is potentially diminishes the value of labor power. I mean, the value of labor power, and you know,
but
in that sense that it diminishes.
You could argue that, but I wanted to give you. I mean, I talk about what was happening in the 1970s, and I also wanted to talk about what is happening at the down market nowadays. So you have thousands of producers, migrants and Brazilians, working in vast networks of clothing production for direct sales, and they were working for the big fast fashion retailers. So their condition now, I mean, we have information about that, we have data about that. It's much better. I mean, it's a very strenuous work, no question about it. We're talking about 12, 14 hours a day of work in their houses with their kids. I mean, this is exactly, I mean, there's no separation between production and productive work. But when you interview them, they will say, I would rather sell my clothes directly in this market. It's my clothes, I'm the boss, and I don't have to, I mean, they would say terrible things, especially women, about their bosses in these workshops, right? So it's more complex than that, right? And they have an interesting, it's not exactly labor power, but I would contend that they have the control over the national's largest garment production center in the country. I mean, which is extremely competitive at the international level. I mean, we are talking about clothes that are preferred to Chinese and Southeast Asian clothes. So I think, I mean, it's not properly an answer, but I think we should take these things into account, especially because informality has been around Brazil for a long time, and that's why I used the term discovery. I mean, informality was already there before the 1970s. And finally, I just wanted to say that I agree that if we approach informality from a semantic perspective, it might be devoid of meaning, but people are doing things with this term. So that's why I wanted to look into the pragmatics of informality. And I mean, she already said what people are doing when they use this word, and they're doing a lot of policies, a lot of politics with that. I think this should be properly studied. Thank
you. I guess I will be very brief. First, I don't know your name. Isadora. I don't have a specific hypothesis about lesbian singers. I guess Rúrion could say much better than I. And I realized that the 4 examples that I would give to present what kind of female singers and composers are taking part of this expansion of critical imagination, 3 of them would be heterosexual, Cel, Tulipa Ruiz, and Lued Luna. And the 4th would be Ana Frango Elétrico. She's a non-binary person. She won yesterday the best album. They have won the best album of last year. And I guess they are a very important example of, but I guess you have an important trail of thought there to this process of invisibility in previous historical moments of the Brazilian music. But I guess it's undeniable that we are facing the process of visibilization of different female experiences. And yes. So your question, your provocation about informality, I guess one part of the problem is, for me, at least, informal public spheres are not unregulated. That's not really the difference. It has to do with power decision and this distinction between strong and weak publics. And I guess the complexity is it doesn't matter exactly that these are weak publics. They are still changing the public life of our societies. And that's why one important concept for me is the distinction between publics and counter-publics. We have this whole discussion in critical theory. And the distinction would be the imagination of new worlds can have different relations with the modern state and institutional politics. There are publics that have an institutional orientation, but there are also publics that have extra institutional and even anti-institutional orientations. And I guess Michael Warner, for example, is a queer theorist, and he argues that the contribution of queer counterpublics is exactly to create and to imagine new shared worlds that are not at all oriented towards the state. So I guess the distinction between formal and informal is complexifying our way of understanding public life, because if you have only the formal is also a naturalization that this is the only thing that matters. And I'm saying, well, there are so much other cultural and social process that are important. So informality in this case, I guess it's a rich distinction, I guess.
Thomas, considering our deadline, should I take the 5 questions at once, or you think it's maybe?
I think we have more or less 20 minutes.
Okay, 20 minutes. Yeah, okay. Then we can have more two rounds of, okay. No, because then we have 5. Yeah, sure. Because we have 5 questions yet. So okay, yeah. We have 3 questions in here. Você de óbvio não sei o nome. Okay, perfect. Then in my list is Talia, and after that Ornella. No? Okay.
Thank you for 3 wonderful presentations. I'm really experienced this as a big intellectual treat. So I have a question for you, Raquel. And I'm trying to be brief. This is what I'm thinking before I start to talk. So your focus was very much on regulation of labor in terms of labor rights, right? And I've been thinking all the time about a group of scholars in Colombia at Bogota at the University of Los Andes, Maria Jose Alvarez and them, because they are also working on care and similar themes, I think, as you do. But what I learned from them is that if you address care work, then you have to think about the idea of time. And there was a bit of place in your presentation, but not so much on time. And then I heard you say, well, these people are working in the place where they produce things. And I wondered about whether you have done work on that dimension of time and what you could say about that, because I really learned the relevance of time poverty and the ways in which the basis of taking the aspect of community as a dimension of care as such an important element in the context of Bogota, because through the community as a unit of care instead of the family, there's a lot of attempts through care blocks to reduce that aspect of time poverty, not the financial poverty, not the economic labor rights, but the time poverty. So I was wondering what your take on that would be. And as an aside, no, I leave the aside for the break because we're running out of time. And then, Jonas, I want to talk about this public space thing and digitalization, but maybe that is an understanding question that I didn't quite get. You seem to be saying that, if I understood you right, that the digitalization creates an open public space and that we shouldn't be reading the intellectual fathers of Habermas because their take on this Adorno is wrong. Now, I'm not a political theorist or a theorist in any way, so my question must be framed in that context, but I'm not so sure whether I see the public sphere as informal. I don't see the informal because I don't know what a formal public sphere is. That seems to me a contradiction in terminus, that something is an Habermasian or Nancy Fraser kind of public space, and it's formal in the sense of what you just said, namely that it's somehow related to the state. So this may need political theory A010 here, I don't know. But my question is the following. If it is true that those platforms that you were talking about are public spheres in that sense, what is the role of the algorithm that wants me to stay there? Because what it proposes me when I stay is not something I like. I'm more likely to stay when I read or look or hear something I don't like. Now, there's research that shows that those platforms gear us to the things that make us upset, because the upsetting is what keeps us on the platform. We keep scrolling as long as we're more and more depressed, and not when we're more and more happy. That is, I only know this because my son does his work in school on this. So I was wondering about that. And then André, I loved your focus on legibility. And I was also thinking about the categorizations that we were talking about yesterday, but I don't think you could be here because you had to teach. But when we talked about the role of categorization in art and in other fields and in indigenous, how do indigenous, is that the right word? Sorry if it's not. But how do state categories not fit? Now, how can those things not be legible? So I think there's a great connection there. But I also thought about the concept of evasion and how people are evading. And this I was thinking about because the first part of your argument reminded me of Jim Scott seeing like a state. But then the second part of your argument seemed to be much more the art of not being governed, which is a much later idea. And in the comparison to Berlin in that context, we have a market in Berlin which is called Thai market. And there's a lot of food selling there. And I had a brilliant PhD student who did a thesis on that. So it's not my knowledge, but the regulation framework to make that market legible is the sanitation laws. And I wondered, because you're selling clothes, your market is selling clothes. And I was wondering about, have you also, because now we're all talking about the materiality of everything and how the materiality matters. So what is the role of the fact that they're selling clothes? And does that matter somehow? Or is that, does that limit or open up other ways of regulating than if they were selling their homemade food? I have a lot to say on this informality thing, but we'll save that.
Well, thank you for our presentation, your presentations. I take a lot of notes and I think a lot, so thank you. My question is to Jonas. It's a little complex. Can I talk in Spanish? Yeah. Okay. Well, switch. Estaba pensando con tu presentación sobre el papel de las tecnologías en estos procesos de digitalización, que son procesos sociales, ¿no? que involucran la relación de las tecnologías con acciones, situaciones, políticas, relaciones anteriores, sociales y demás. En ese sentido, si bien estoy completamente de acuerdo con vos en que bueno, Adorno aquí no tiene mucho que hacer. ¿Te rompí el corazón, José Luis? Ah, ok.
Vino la palabra. Mencionaron dos veces.
me parece que también hay que entrar a las tecnologías en concreto y pensar las diferencias en este proceso de digitalización. Y sobre eso quería preguntarte si, bueno, habías hecho algunas diferencias. Vos mencionaste en la misma frase a MySpace y Spotify, que son dos tecnologías completamente distintas en la relación con el usuario, y pienso una hipótesis al respecto. Spotify es una tecnología mucho más formalizada que MySpace, que era, MySpace uno subía lo que le parecía, había muchos formatos permitidos. Para subir una canción a Spotify uno tiene que contratar una empresa. O sea, ningún músico en el mundo sube una canción a Spotify sin contratar una agregadora digital. Ahí hay un nuevo intermediario, ¿no? En esta pregunta de, bueno, ¿cuáles son los nuevos intermediarios de estos modelos de digitalización? Pero bueno, creo que ahí hay que pensar en una historia de las tecnologías y de lo que habilitan y lo que no habilitan. O sea, no es lo mismo lo que habilita MySpace, lo que habilitaba, que yo creo, esto es una posición normativa, fue un momento dorado de la autogestión, a lo que permite hoy Spotify para los músicos y también para los oyentes, porque entiendo que tu preocupación tiene que ver más con los públicos, pero la libertad que permite Spotify, y en esto un poco estoy de acuerdo con lo que comentaba la compañera, bueno, el algoritmo ahí tiene un papel que no tenía en esas otras tecnologías, ¿no? Y te lleva hacia lugares que uno no sabe si quiere ir. Entonces, bueno, estaba pensando un poco en eso, en cómo entrarle a las tecnologías y a sus diferencias, que quizás implica un trabajo interdisciplinario, en la línea de lo que propone Mecila, ¿no? De pensar con otros esas tecnologías y cómo son pensadas. Eso es un primer comentario, que no hay una pregunta quizás tanto. Y después también me interesé mucho en lo que te preguntó Isadora sobre las mujeres cantantes. Y ahí creo, te quería preguntar si identificás en este desplazamiento, en esta predominancia relativa contemporánea de las mujeres en esta esfera de la música, otros procesos políticos o sociales que estuvieron también entroncándose, ¿no? Como relacionándose con las tecnologías. Las tecnologías habilitaron, pero también hubo otros, me imagino que también en Brasil debe haber habido procesos de colectivización de demandas y otras cuestiones que pusieron a las mujeres en ese lugar, ¿no? Por ejemplo, en Argentina no se puede entender la predominancia que hoy tienen las mujeres en la industria de la música si no se entiende, si no se conoce toda la marea verde, lo que se llamó la marea verde y lo que implicó, o sea, todas cómo un montón de luchas se unieron a esa lucha por el aborto legal, ¿no? Las tecnologías fueron fundamentales, pero ahí hubo como esos entrelazamientos con procesos que eran anteriores también, ¿no? Bueno, eso. Gracias por dejarme hablar en español, que soy más encantadora.
Vocês querem que eu abra a mão também? Eu vou ser bem rápido, tá? Porque acho que a gente já está bastante adiantado. Em primeiro lugar, queria agradecer as apresentações, porque elas fizeram a gente pensar bastante, né? E eu tenho um comentário para a Raquel e para o André, se vocês me permitem fazer em português, Raquel, né? Que é o seguinte, acho que o tema já foi tocado aqui, né? Mas a gente sempre está falando de formalizar as informalidades, né? E eu gostaria de, talvez, pensar ao revés, de virar um pouco a caixa, né? E se o futuro for mais informal do que formal, né? E aí acho que isso coloca outras questões para a gente. E aí eu posso me referir, por exemplo, ao que está acontecendo atualmente com o mercado de trabalho, né? Eu sei que informalidade não é só trabalho, né? Acho que é mais amplo do que isso, mas a gente está caminhando para um modelo que tem mais de informalidade do que de formalidade. Então, eu gostaria, talvez, se vocês pudessem comentar algo do tipo, assim, se a gente pode pensar as informalidades não só pelo viés da formalização delas, e sim, enfim, por outro viés, tá bom? Jonas, comentário bem rápido aqui. Gostei bastante da apresentação também, mas eu fiquei me questionando o tempo inteiro se o Habermas funciona para o que você está tentando mostrar. Tá? E por que eu digo isso? Acho que quando Habermas fala de uma esfera pública, tá, a gente sabe que o público ele tem sentidos múltiplos aqui, né? Mas ele estava falando sobretudo de uma esfera compartilhada. Tá certo? Publicamente, claro, né? Enfim. E o que você está me mostrando com essas novas tecnologias é o seguinte: a gente tem mais, as pessoas talvez tenham mais acesso, ou seja, elas podem publicizar mais os seus trabalhos, mas esse caráter compartilhado, eu acho que ele sofreu uma fragmentação, tá certo? Eu vou dar um exemplo bem claro aqui para nós brasileiros, pelo menos, né? Antigamente, Jornal Nacional era uma referência para todo mundo, a novela e tal. Hoje em dia, com essas novas tecnologias, a gente tem uma série de nichos, né? E aí me corrija se eu estiver errado, mas que tem pouco acesso de pessoas que não fazem parte desse nicho. Tá? Eu, por exemplo, sei muito pouco o que acontece nas redes sociais da extrema-direita, ou, enfim, de muitos outros grupos, né? E aí eu fico pensando assim, será que nessa condição dessas tecnologias fragmentadas, essa noção de esfera pública como uma esfera compartilhada, ela ainda funciona? Tá? Essa é a pergunta que eu faço para você. Obrigado.
Bueno, Jonas, no estuviste, creo, en la conferencia de ayer, de modo que no te habrás dado cuenta las bromas que hicieron las colegas, porque yo dije algo bastante diferente a lo que dijiste vos. Yo estudié el mercado del libro, sobre todo el libro literario, y creo que en la evaluación de los new gatekeepers, yo soy mucho más negativo que vos, y probablemente haya en eso una diferencia generacional. Yo creo que hay una diferencia generacional. Yo soy viejo y por lo tanto lo veo de otra manera, pero me interesó en algún momento estudiar este fenómeno porque me llamaron por teléfono una vez que un periodista que se había hecho un acto en la Feria del Libro de Buenos Aires en la cual se convocaban a los booktubers and book tiktokers, etcétera, y se había llenado de gente y entonces, claro, se transformó en un hecho social significativo, entonces me consultaron y yo lo que dije es que las empresas están mirando allí cuántos seguidores tienen y a los que tienen muchos seguidores inmediatamente los colonizan. Y eso ocurrió. Y de hecho ocurre y uno puede encontrar casos. Por otra parte, me interesó ver las trayectorias. No son chicos tan espontáneos como parecen. Muchos de ellos vienen de la formación académica y encontraron en esto un vehículo de conseguir trabajo y por lo tanto desalmidonan su discurso, lo disfrazan de espontáneo y de fresco pero es tramposo. He tratado de ver las trayectorias de esos mensajes que nos llegan en Google, muchas veces de periodistas culturales que nos dicen cuáles son los 5 libros que tengo que leer antes de morirme y cosas por el estilo. Esos periodistas culturales, fíjense, a veces abajo dice de dónde provienen y la mayoría son expertos en marketing. Entonces, es una gigantesca trampa. Yo no es que sea adorniano, ni pretendo sacar patente de apocalíptico, ni nada por el estilo, pero creo que es necesario advertir esa trampa. La trampa consiste en decir que si alguien piensa que los viejos críticos emitían discursos socialmente significativos, pues entonces uno saca patente de anacrónico, elitista o lo que fuere. Y yo me niego a aceptar eso. Creo que para entrar en el juego de ese debate, hay que producir no ya una ruptura de la vieja autonomía burdiana del campo literario y pensar en posautonomía. Simplemente lo que hay que hacer es denegar, para usar un término burdiano, denegar fuertemente el dinero para pensar como vos. Es decir, para pensar que en esos nuevos gatekeepers puede haber efectivamente una imaginación creativa, una imaginación crítica. Es decir, que de allí pueden surgir nuevas modalidades críticas no necesariamente sujetas al interés de las empresas o al interés del dinero. Pero reitero, es un debate que no lo vamos a poder saldar acá. Yo tengo una mirada más optimista, más pesimista. Sí. No, ahora me mandaron a Sigmundo. Sí. Simplemente quería explicarte las risas y los comentarios, pero depende de la óptica donde lo veamos y probablemente depende de las trayectorias nuestras también.
Thank you very much for the questions and the comments. Maybe I want to start by summarizing really briefly what I try to do here, because even if I put a lot of emphasis on the labor market, my idea was actually to also try to go beyond it. So I'm taking on Talia's question. Of course, I'm interested, or I said some stuff about formalizing in the sense of providing more labor rights to those workers. But at the same time, what I tried to do was trying to see in which other context informality and care have been analyzed and put together. And there is where I was talking about the informal care arrangements. That is something that some theorists that have been discussing about care regimes propose when we're talking about care arrangements that are not formalized, that are not institutionalized in the sense that they do not follow some strict regulations. So of course, when we talk about care provided by the state, I mean, we have regulations and we have norms, and the opposite happens when we look at families and communities. And I'm going to go back to this when I take on Alan's question. But now about the time dimension, of course, is extremely important. And it's another way of measuring inequalities too, or it could be another way of measuring inequalities. Time deprivation is completely interlinked with monetary poverty too. And this is something that it's quite important when we want to measure what I was mentioning, what feminist economists want to do, of providing value to how much care it's not being considered in the GDPs. Because the way of doing this is asking how much time somebody spends doing housework, and then seeing what the time would have been if this person have been remunerated by that. If I said I spent, 5 hours a day taking care of a kid, how much a nanny will get for the same work, and then they put this all in the numbers. So I think it's quite important, but yeah, it gives us one dimension. And again, in the case of Colombia, I know that they have also been doing a lot of research on the time that household workers spend in the public transportation, because normally those that don't live in the place where they work, they live really far away from the more elite neighborhoods. So they actually spend so much time just moving back and forth. And this is another dimension that actually we should also consider when we talk about labor conditions. So yeah, definitely time is really important. It depends on what we want to see when we're discussing care, but it's definitely an important relation. Now, briefly about Alan's provocation. Yeah, I agree with you. It's interesting to invert the terms, but informality, the way we have been talking about it today, is actually a negative term. Informal is not formal. And what's formal means to be in accordance to regulations, and regulations change. So in a way, they're fluid concepts, and it's not so rigid either. So what was informal, some years ago is formal now, and the other way around. So sometimes we're already doing that without realizing. Nevertheless, I think that's, again, what I try to do with my presentation. And I think that's why the labor market is so present when we discuss informality. But if we shift our perspective and we look at it from another standpoint, maybe informality loses a bit its pejorativity. Because within the labor market, we want people to be formal because that means they have access to labor rights, to social security, to health insurance, to retirement rights. Who wouldn't, advocate for that? But if we also look at these other more communitarian or alternative ways of caring that have been deemed by some theorists as informal, I'm not sure that is so bad. So I think it's also about defining what we mean by informality, and it does not necessarily have to be something bad. And maybe, at least in the aspect of care, maybe it is the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again, because I mean, your answer to the question is something I won't even dare to continue. Perfect, thank you. But I just want to address Talia's comment and question, and begin by apologizing for not being with you and missing all the fun yesterday. I was teaching. Tuesdays are my teaching day. But yes, I think the evasion has a lot to do with this not fitting into categories, and I feel bad for missing your discussion. I hope it's available online soon. And you were right to point out that the major influences and for this presentation today were James Scott, Tim Mitchell, basically both of them. And I just want to be a bit cautious about the art of not being governed, because I'm not, especially due to the debate we're having today, I'm not Hayekian. I'm not saying that this market is some sort of beautiful anarchy, but other than that, the art of not being governed comes to some of the points. And the question about materiality and the regulation or control through materiality, it's a very good question, and I have to do more research on this. I haven't researched exactly this point, but I have a sense that it doesn't play a very important role, because the legal solution, which is the individual micro-entrepreneur, entails a lump sum payment for taxes and the pension scheme. So if you make up to, I don't know, 180,000, I guess, reais per year, and you have up to one employee, you can become an individual micro-entrepreneur, and then you would just pay a lump sum, and it helps with this problem of control. You don't have to actually control how many pieces you are selling, right? And yes, the future is informal. Thank you very much for your answer. So we can discuss this more later. Thank you.
So thank you for all your questions. They were very interesting. I will answer them very briefly. So formal versus informal, I guess what is important for me is what Nancy Fraser has formulated. So strong publics, they have not only opinion formation, but also decision making, and the difference that weak publics have only opinion formation. So I would say that I am much more in depth with Nancy Fraser than with Habermas. I will get to that. I don't defend that platforms are creating public spheres. People are creating public spheres, and platforms are an important part of this process in our times. But we need to maintain the ambivalence. They are this capitalist new digital culture industry. But there is another whole part. The process is always twofold. So about history of technology, thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. You're completely right. And I guess there is this tendency, capitalism is very strong and creative. And in other moments of the internet, things were very different. And streaming platforms are totally different than blogs, or I don't know the name in English, I don't know, piracy websites. So the relation was completely different, and we need to take this into account. there is certainly a relation between social struggles and feminist movement and this protagonism of female singers in the Brazilian music. It's wonderful to know that in Argentina something similar is going on, but I guess we here in CEBRAP we have a research line on the Brazilian feminist movement, and we have this diagnosis that things are also incomparable in the sense that the Argentinian feminist movement is so much stronger and the capacity to influence the political process, we are not even near to talk about abortion as a public issue. The Ministry of Women in this Lula term has said in São Paulo, most important journal, that talk about abortion is an irresponsibility. So things are connected, but clearly for me, the feminist movement is not exactly in the same place as in Argentina. What? No, I'm talking about the minister.
I know, but I mean, what they say, it's not a reflection of what the feminist movement is doing.
Yes, but we are currently writing a piece on an ethnographic observation about the 8th March, and clearly the governance sector of the feminist movement is also playing its role in not criticizing the government that is not open to feminist issues. So we have this complex relation between feminist movements, social movements, political parties. It's very complex. But I'm not saying, of course, there are important sectors that I am aligned with, clearly. So don't get me wrong, I am not Habermasian. I'm basically reading post-Habermasian social theory, but Habermas is the only one that is talking about this formal versus informal. So he was an ally to structure this presentation right here about informality. But clearly, Nancy Fraser, Michael Warner, Oscar Negt, and Alexander Klug are post-Habermasian critical theories that are much more important for me than Habermas. And well, I would say I guess this generational aspect is very important, and I guess we can also play with this dialogue because we can see different things starting from different social places. But for me, the most important thing is to sustain the ambivalence of the process, right? So I'm not saying that there aren't these companies and marketing strategies. Capitalism is happening always. But I guess my presentation can sound unilateral because what I'm trying to say is that you cannot make this other social and cultural process invisible. These are happening. It can be minoritarian, it can be counter tendencies, but they are there. And so if you are not approaching major tendencies and minor counter tendencies, then we are not doing critical theory. That's my point.
Otherwise it would be marmalade. Yeah, that's true. Marmelada. So Raquel, André, and Jonas, thank you very much for this stimulating discussion. And now we'll have a coffee break, and after that, the other section.
We'll be back 5:15, please.